On April 24th, 1898, the order came down with the force of history. African American regiments of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, along with the 24th and 25th Infantry, were dispatched for the Spanish-American War. In camp, the words passed from officer to sergeant, from sergeant to trooper, from trooper to friend, until every tent seemed to hold the same electric silence. War had already been spoken of in newspapers and train stations, in barber shops and schoolrooms, in whispered arguments about Cuba, duty, and American honor. But now it was no longer distant. It had a date, it had names, it had regiments, and among them stood men who had carried the burden of service for years, even while the nation they served often denied them full dignity. These soldiers were veterans of hardship before they ever saw a foreign shore. They had marched the frontier, guarded mail routes, faced harsh weather, poor supplies, and the daily insult of prejudice. Yet when the summons came, they answered as soldiers always answer. In the dust of a Texas camp, boots planted firm beneath them, they listened as their future shifted. The 9th, the 10th, the 24th, the 25th, 4 regiments, already tested, now called toward a war that promised glory in headlines and danger in reality. Some men felt pride first, others felt caution, many felt both. None could fully know where the order would lead, but everyone understood this much: they were about to step into a chapter the country might remember, even if it did not yet know how to speak their names. The men who formed these regiments did not march toward war as strangers to discipline. The Buffalo Soldiers, as the cavalrymen of the 9th and 10th had come to be known, had earned hard respect on the western frontier. Their service was not romantic. It was labor under pressure, endurance without applause, danger met in silence. The infantrymen of the 24th and 25th had built their own record through drill, field duty, and steadfast service in posts where praise was scarce and expectations harsh. In camp, there was no need for grand speeches to explain what military readiness meant. It lived in the rhythm of routine. Leather was checked, rifles were cleaned, bedrolls were tied tight, horses were inspected. Every buckle, cartridge, and canteen mattered. Sergeant Elijah Carter knew that war often revealed itself first in small failures: a loose strap, a damp cartridge, a tired horse. So he checked everything twice. Corporal Samuel Whitaker, who had seen enough service to mistrust excitement, moved with calm economy. He understood the difference between display and preparedness. Nearby, young Private Thomas Reed watched men older than he was transform uncertainty into action. He learned from the way they packed. The way their seriousness had no need to announce itself. These regiments had long been asked to prove themselves. They had proved themselves in heat, distance, and isolation. Now they were being sent where the nation might finally see them. Yet even that possibility brought no ease. Visibility could mean recognition. It could also mean scrutiny. They would be expected to fight bravely, endure quietly, and answer insult with discipline. It was a burden they knew well, and still, as the sun climbed over the camp and gear was made ready, they prepared not as symbols, but as soldiers. Dispatch did not happen only on paper. It happened in stations where steam clouded the air and made every farewell feel temporary, even when no one believed it. It happened in the brief clasp of hands, in the careful choice of final words, in the effort to look steady for the sake of those left behind. Anna Carter met her brother at the rail depot with the posture of someone determined not to break in public. A schoolteacher, accustomed to measured speech, she understood how history could be taught in neat lines and dates. But standing before Elijah in his uniform, she felt the truth that history was always more personal than its records. It belonged to families as much as nations. Elijah accepted her worry the way soldiers accept weather, without complaint, because complaint changes nothing. He told her he would do his duty. She told him to come back with his name intact, with his honor untouched by whatever the world tried to place upon him. Around them, the platform echoed with similar partings. Some men had wives, some had mothers, some had no one there, but still stood among the embraces of others, carrying private loneliness beneath a public uniform. Young Thomas Reed watched all this and felt the cost of departure in a new way. A regiment moved as a body, but each man boarded with his own memory, his own fear, his own reason for standing in line. The locomotive hissed like a warning. Orders were called. Trunks were lifted. Rifles were slung. There was little room for long sentiment. In war, movement has its own discipline. Yet the silence that followed each farewell said more than speeches could. These soldiers were leaving communities that knew both their worth and the injustice they lived under. Their departure carried pride, but not innocence. Families understood that service might win admiration from strangers, while changing little at home. Even so, they sent their men forward. The train would carry them south and east toward embarkation, toward uncertainty, and toward a battlefield where courage would be demanded, whether or not equality followed. As the regiments moved through southern towns on their way toward the ports, they entered a landscape of contradiction. They wore the uniform of the United States, carried its weapons, and answered its call. Yet in many of the places they passed, the rights associated with citizenship remained uneven, fragile, or openly denied. The same flag that fluttered above the street could signify national purpose for some and bitter irony for others. Crowds gathered whenever soldiers marched through. Some looked on with genuine admiration. They saw disciplined men in uniform and recognized courage before it was tested. Others watched with unease, their prejudice disturbed by the undeniable sight of black soldiers serving with order and skill. There were stares, muttered remarks, hats tipped in respect, and hard expressions that gave none. The troops had learned long before this journey that dignity was often maintained not by argument, but by bearing. Sergeant Elijah Carter kept his eyes front. He knew that one wrong glance might be interpreted as insolence, one moment of anger as confirmation of lies others already believed. Corporal Whitaker had a sharper edge beneath his calm. He knew how thin the line could be between parade and confrontation. Private Thomas Reed felt every pair of eyes on the column, but the rhythm of the march steadied him. Left, right, left. In step, men could carry more than packs. They could carry expectation, insult, and pride all at once. This was part of their service too, to pass through a country that depended on them while doubting them, to represent discipline in places that offered little justice in return. The road to war did not begin at the shoreline. It began here, on streets where each regiment was seen as both defender and outsider. Their composure was not emptiness, it was controlled defiance. Every polished button, every straight line of march, every unbroken formation declared a fact no crowd could erase. These men belonged to the story of the nation, whether the nation was ready to admit it or not. Once aboard the transport, the certainty of movement became something else: distance. Land fell away. Familiar sounds disappeared. The world narrowed to deck planks, sea wind, metal fittings, and the horizon ahead. On shipboard, soldiers lived close to one another and even closer to their thoughts. There was time now to imagine what the papers had simplified. War on the page could sound swift, righteous, almost clean. War across the water felt heavier. It smelled of salt, tar, sweat, and waiting. Elijah stood by the rail and finally opened the letter Anna had pressed into his hand. Her words were simple, but they carried the full weight of home. Remember who you are. Remember that being seen matters. Remember that coming back matters too. He folded the page carefully, as if neatness could preserve the world behind him. Samuel Whitaker, never one for speeches, used humor the way some men used prayer. He spoke of bad rations, rough bunks, and officers who never seemed to sleep. A few men laughed softly. The laughter mattered. It reminded them that courage was not only found in charges and battle cries. Sometimes it lived in the refusal to surrender ordinary humanity. Thomas Reed looked out over the water and tried to fit himself into the history unfolding around him. He had enlisted for reasons both practical and proud. Service offered wages, structure, purpose. It also offered a chance, however uncertain, to stand in a place where his conduct could not be dismissed. Yet he knew the danger of believing too much in what war might change. Older soldiers had already taught him that heroism did not guarantee justice. Still, he wanted to believe that sacrifice meant something larger than headlines. Around him, the 9th, the 10th, the 24th, and the 25th moved toward a conflict that would test more than military skill. It would test whether the country could witness valor without looking away from the men who embodied it. The sea stretched on, indifferent and immense, carrying them from one world into another. When we remember April 24th, 1898, we can say that African American regiments of the 9th and 10th Cavalry, along with the 24th and 25th Infantry, were dispatched for the Spanish-American War. The sentence is true. It is also incomplete, because inside that fact were human lives, men with families, habits, jokes, fears, and private convictions. Veterans who knew the Army's demands, younger soldiers who were still discovering what service would ask of them, communities that gave them strength even while grieving their departure. These regiments carried rifles, sabers, bedrolls, and ammunition, but they carried something else as well. They carried the burden of representation in a country eager for their service and hesitant about their equality. They carried discipline forged under double pressure, the ordinary dangers of military life and the extra scrutiny reserved for black men in uniform. They carried the hope that bravery might force recognition, and the sober knowledge that recognition could be delayed, distorted, or denied. Yet they went. That is the truth that endures. They went not because the nation had fully honored them, but because duty, pride, and professionalism demanded action. Their dispatch marked more than a logistical movement of troops. It marked the entrance of long-proven regiments into a war that would bring their service into sharper public view. In the years that followed, their courage would help write a larger story about military honor and American contradiction. But on that day, none of it was yet settled. There was only the order, the departure, the march, the sea, and the men themselves. Sergeant Elijah Carter, steadfast and unspectacular in the best military sense, embodied the discipline that held a regiment together. Corporal Samuel Whitaker carried the hard-earned realism of a soldier who trusted deeds more than promises. Private Thomas Reed stood for the younger men who stepped toward history before they fully understood its cost. And beyond them were thousands more, real men in real formations, moving under command into uncertainty. Their story deserves more than a footnote. It deserves to be spoken with clarity. On that spring day in 1898, African American soldiers answered the call to war. They did so with order, dignity, and resolve. And before a shot was ever fired, that alone had already become part of history.